Alright guys, another day, another video. So, in today's video, we finally add the Vapor server to our InstaClone application. And if you've been following along, you know that we hard-coded all of our data for now into the API service so that we could just kind of keep moving forward and make things look somewhat realistic in terms of screen loading and stuff like that. So we will finally get rid of this and move to a real database backend and Vapor server so that we can continue to use Swift, the language, in the backend and possibly reuse some code as well. So let's get started. Now, the reason why I'm showing you this configuration file is because it is a best practice to not put your passwords and secret keys into the code itself, right? But into a config file, a .env file. So I've already gone ahead and done that, and these are my variable names. So now when I'm ready to check this guy into GitHub, my .env is not going to be included, and therefore the passwords and whatever secret keys that I may have will not be shown, to the entire world that has access to my project. So definitely keep that in mind when you are building your own project. The other thing is we're going to be using Vapor with Fluent, the ORM. And part of the reason why we're going to do that is, in my case, I'm using PG, Postgres, right? But if you don't like Postgres, Fluent supports MySQL and MongoDB as well. So you can use that same backend, but all of the code with Fluent and Vapor will be identical. So whatever code I have, you will be able to use even if you're on a different database. All right, so finishing with that, the other quick thing that I would like to note is I am going to use the date utils that we created from the last project, right? We created this helper that's going to give us some constants and give us some conversion of the date object into more readable strings. So I think that at least some of this code might be useful on the server side. And definitely, since we are using Swift on the back end as well as the client, and that's kind of the whole point of why we're using Vapor, right? It would be great to be able to reuse a lot of this code as well as any other helpers that we devise in the future. So I've moved the code into a Swift package, and I'm referencing it over here. If you're not familiar with Swift packages, leave a comment, and in my next video, I will do a little rundown of how I created the package and what some of these parameters mean. All right, so let's get started with the project itself. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a server-side version of these models. So user, I renamed person to user, comment, news, and user content. So we're going to reconstruct these in a way that fits the backend better. So we're going to slightly restructure some of the fields and whatnot, but we won't necessarily have to change the models on the client side. I mean, we may change some things, but we don't have to map like for like, which is the whole reason of having models on the client side anyway. So what we're going to do is I'm going to start with the user model, right, in the models folder. And each of these model types requires basically three things. It requires a The model definition itself, it requires something called a migration that will allow us to have Fluent automatically create the associated tables and fields with the proper types, and then some sort of controller. Now, you don't necessarily have to map a single controller to a single model. I'm going to do it that way here just to keep things kind of simple and easy to understand, but there's no reason why you have to do that. But again, we're going to follow that path in order to keep things simple and easy to understand. Once we create some of these structures, we have to initialize them. So for example, if we create a user controller, we have to register it in the routes file. And then if we create a migration for a user or whatever else we create, it has to be initialized in the configure file. So let's get started. So the first guy that we're going to create is the user. And we need Vapor and we need Fluent. Again, Vapor is the server framework and Fluent is the driver and ORM for the database access. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a class, and it's going to have to inherit from model and optionally inherit from content. So the reason why it's a class is because it's required in order to inherit from model. I'm using the final keyword only to get a very slight performance benefit, because I know that I'm never going to inherit from user. And I'm including content only because I intend to return this object model to the client caller, and therefore it means it has to be encodable into JSON, and that's what content allows, to decode from JSON and to encode into JSON. All right, so the first thing that we need to do is we need to reference the table name that is going to be associated with this model. After that, we can start creating any of the fields that we need associated to this user model. So the first field that we're going to create is ID, and it's going to be an optional UUID because Fluent is going to fill in dynamically that ID for us just before we send our call to create a new model instance. So the next thing that I want to create, or the next field and column that I want to create, is the username, and this is going to be a string. And since this is a user, we'll just go ahead and create the email, and then the password. Now, there are a couple of other fields that I want to create, but I'm going to need the other models to exist first. These fields are going to be about pointing associations to other models. So we're going to wait to create those until the other models are created. So now what I want to do is I want to create auditable fields. So created by, created on, last modified by, last modified on, so that we can track the changes, like who made the changes and when they made them, stuff like that. Okay, so I gotta fix this. So what we're going to do here is we're going to use the timestamp wrapper property, And the reason why we're going to use that is that, again, just like this, Fluent will auto-populate this field. Take a look at my notes here. It's going to auto-populate the field based upon when it's happening. So if it's happening on a creation, it's going to do that. If it's happening on an update, totally cannot type today. If it's happening on an update, then it will auto-populate this guy for us. And again, they're optional because we're leaving it up to Fluent to do the population of those fields. So then we need a default constructor to comply with this protocol for the purposes of letting Fluent do its thing in terms of initialization of optional fields. And then we're also going to create our own constructor to make it easier for us to instantiate instances of this model. So the reason why I am giving it a default value is because I want to be able to distinguish between inserts, updates, deletes, whatever the case may be, that were made by the application from updates that were made from, say, for example, a script on a cron job, or perhaps in the future I'll have a secondary service that runs background tasks or something like that. So by being able to give the particular service or app that made the change, if there's some sort of issue, it helps me track down what the affected code is or where that code would be. So that's the only reason why I'm having these auditable related fields. Whoops. Checking that everything compiles. All right. So now that we've created our model, we need to create our migration. And the migration is completely distinct from the model. So what I mean by that is that we can create a model that, yes, whatever fields we are using from the database, they have to line up. So we're about to create some fields and related structures in the migration. And so those structures have to line up. However, I can create other fields, properties, maybe computed properties, functions, whatever, that have nothing to do with any structures on the database, but I'm totally free, even though this is a model, to do that, because all of this code is really not so much about the database, but about me doing things on the application layer. So it's really this file that's going to deal with the structure and the schema at the database level. So the way that we create that is we inherit a struct from the migration, and these migrations that we're about to construct are only ever going to run once, assuming we did them properly. And in this file, and not the model, is where we structure the database. So in this case, we are structuring the one table. It's called users, which again has to map to the fields in the model, so that Fluent will know which table or which fields that are being referred to. There is a built-in helper function that will create a primary key of type UUID on our behalf. So that's the guy right there. So then after that, we create the related fields. And what we can do is we can give the field a name, a type, and state whether it is required or not. Now, in our case, we're not going to use the type string because it defaults to the text type in Postgres, which is a very large type and a waste for something as small as username. And I'm sure MySQL and MongoDB has similar types as well. So what we're going to use is we're going to use custom. We are going to make it required. And this is the varchar type in Postgres. So obviously, if you're using a different database with different syntax, you are going to have to update this to whatever is appropriate to that database. But in terms of actual code and the queries that you're going to see in a few minutes, it's identical, and there is no database specific call. And we'll be able to just learn Fluent once and reuse the syntax and the queries across different databases. So we've created our username. I'm going to make this 100 for the email just in case. The username, email, and password. And then now we're going to create the created by. Let's keep 60 for created by. Now for created on, we are going to use date time because we want to include the time into some of these changes so we have an exact view. So here we're going to do last modified by. Let's copy this again. All All right, so Fluent Migrations API is pretty complete. So on top of being able to create these fields, you can also create various constraints. So in this case, we're creating the unique constraint. We're also optionally able to give it a specific name if we want to. So we're going to give it that name because we want every single person to have a unique username and a unique email for obvious reasons. And then the last call that needs to be made is the create call. There's also an update call. There's also an update call and a delete call, but we're not going to be using those. We're just going to create one time. So that's the first thing that we have to make. And the other thing that we have to make in order to comply with this protocol is revert. And all that revert means is to undo or to drop the table that I just created or created previously. So again, we have no need to actually run this, but we do need to comply with the protocol. So that's the reason why we have it here. So these are the two main things that we needed to create. And in order to actually make use of this model after we do the migration that creates our tables, we need a controller. Again, I'm going to create a controller specific to users, but there's no absolute necessity that you have to do that. So if it makes sense, like in the case of some other project that you might be working on, then feel free to go ahead and put it into a controller of a different name. So as indicated here, we have our route collection, and that's what our controller has to inherit from. And the only thing we have to create that is override is this boot, which is basically a bootstrapper for some of the base functionality of our controller. So what we're going to do here is we're going to use the routes to create a subdirectory in our URL specific only to users. So this is going to look like mydomainname.com/users. So whenever somebody comes to that directory, they're only going to be accessing the routes inside of this controller. And at least for now, the only call that we're going to have is we're going to have this, let's see here. I'll update this to user eventually. I've switched the name to user from person because like I said last time, I'm pretty terrible at naming stuff. So so we're gonna just have this base call, right? Get following, meaning the people that this current user is following, and we're gonna associate that function that we're gonna create to the HTTP verb get. So if we wanted to, and we probably will later, there's a post, there's put, there's patch, there's all the standard HTTP verbs. And we're going to hook into those eventually. But for now, we only need this guy. So we're going to create this guy. Now, the only parameter, right? Because you see here, we're not calling the function, we're just passing it in. So we could have also had a closure in here as well if we wanted to. But the signature is, the only parameter is the request object. So none of the parameters, if there are any, are coming in to the function directly, although they are living inside of the request object indirectly. So The other thing to note is this guy. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail into this. Like I said, if you need to know all the ins and outs of Vapor, you really have to watch the Vapor introduction video, because it's too much to put in into this mix with the InstaClone. But basically, this returned object, whatever type it may be, cannot be null. So we cannot do this. Okay, and that is somewhat indicated by the fact that this function throws, and all of these routing functions will throw. And that just means that in the case of an error, or if the desired object, whatever it may be, happens to be null, then you're going to end up having to throw. Okay, and what that looks like is, so in this case, just to get started, we're just gonna grab everything. We're just grabbing everything. We're not doing any filter. We're not doing any removal. We're just grabbing everything. And then we're taking that result set and we're somehow changing it to a different but related result set. So in this case, the reason why I'm doing that is because I want to wipe out the password before I send it off to the client, right? So that's why I am doing that, because as I stated, in order to be able to return or to accept something as a parameter to a routing call, you have to inherit from content, which is what enables it to be encoded or decoded to JSON. And that's what's going to happen automatically for us by Vapor. So we needed, that's why we needed that protocol in there. So that's what mapping is doing for us, allowing us to transform this in some way and return it, or even return completely distinct objects, as long as, of course, they comply to this. So we confirm this compiles. All right, cool. So that compiles, and that gets us to our initial set of related models for user. And then the next thing that we want to do before we move on is we want to make sure that this specific model gets initialized, and therefore the table is created in the database, right? So just make sure as we create this that you always have the correct order. So if this guy depends on another table, a field in another table, that table has to be migrated first. Okay, so order does matter. So then the other thing we want to do is we want to register our newly created controller, right? So that Vapor is aware of its existence, and all the routes that are under here will go to the functions of this controller. Okay, so we're going to repeat this whole process for each of these models that we need. And again, on the server side, I am constructing these models to work efficiently and properly from a database perspective. And then over here, it's possible that some of these fields may in fact be different from what we get back from what's going to be a web API, the Vapor server, may in fact be different or not entirely identical to the models on the server, simply because the client has different needs in order to take this data and display it out to the users. So just be aware of that. And then what's the next thing that I want to create? The next thing that I want to create is the user content. So we're looking at it over here on the client side. And what I'm going to do, I was going to create a folder, but we don't need it yet. All right, so again, a final class. We need the model. I don't remember if I'm returning this, but I think I am. So we need the content. Again, we need to reference the table. So let's see here, user content. So we are not ready to start loading images and videos into our database, although eventually we will. I am still leaving the resources as assets on the client side. So what this field for now is going to represent is the name of that image in order to be able to grab it from the asset catalog. So the next thing that we're going to create is an optional field. And obviously that means that we don't have to necessarily populate it, and that's why it's an optional string. Then we need a reference to user ID, which is at the code level a reference to the entire object itself, which obviously is convenient because then we get access to all the fields. But in terms of the database, it's just going to be the user ID, because obviously that's the structure of a normal table in the database. So then, now that we've created this guy, what we need to do is go back to our user, and we need to indicate that this is a one-to-many association. So what does that look like? Yeah. So the nice thing about this is it's actually done via a static type. So that owner variable that we just created, this guy is now pointing to that actual typed field. So in this case, because these are one-to-many, right? A single person can have multiple pieces of content that they uploaded. However, each piece of content can only have one owner, which would be this person, this particular person. So that's the relationship that we are creating here. Now, at the database level, this does not exist in the user table at all, because we don't need it to create that association. We only need the user ID as a foreign key in the user content table to the users table. So in the database, at the database level, only that relationship is necessary. But in order for this guy to do lazy loading of this data, meaning we make a single query but we include this related data, we need this association at the model level. All right. I think I'm kind of adding a lot of information here, so I'm going to start cutting this down somewhat. And I would suggest that if you feel a little bit lost, which is totally understandable, but if you do, you should go and watch the other video. So let's move on. Now, the rest of the fields are going to be the auditing fields. So I'm just going to copy and paste these because we've already seen these. So this guy also needs an association to comments. So I'm just going to leave a little gap right here to remind myself after I create the comments model. So then we need our default constructor, and we're going to create our own helper constructor. And all we need to set is whatever the image name path is, and then the optional description, the owner, I should probably set some kind of global constant for this app name, but it's not a big deal. We can always take care of it later. All right, so just boilerplate code, initializing a bunch of stuff. Be aware also that this is the way that the associations are supposed to be set. So you're not setting the whole object, you're just setting the ID, and then Vapor is going to take care of the rest for you. Just making sure everything compiles. Yes. So I'm going to assume that it was set either from the database or by Vapor. In order for me to even, bother making this association, it would seem likely that this owner actually does exist. And if they do, then they definitely have an ID already. So this is a safe cast that we can do. And moving right along, we go to create our migration. So we're going to create the other migration. I think this is inside of Fluent actually. So we need our prepare. We need our revert. So just like we did before, we're going to define which table that is being created in this particular migration. So we start with image, and we're going to do the custom again. And we're going to make it required again. So this was the description. We need to blow this up actually. So later on this is probably going to be, or at least it could be, some sort of URL. So I'm going to make this much bigger. And then a description could also be much longer as well. So let's do that for sizing. And this is our first reference that we're going to be migrating into. So we're going to define that it's of type UUID. It is required. And over here, you see here, the owner of this user content is of type user. And in the database, it's referring to the user ID field. So we're creating this field right now. We're making it UUID type. We're making it required. And then finally, the reference itself is going to be to the users table for the field called ID. And just like we did last time, we need the auditable fields. So I'm just going to copy and paste them because we did this already. And it's going to be the same sizing and the date time. So now we are going to create the controller for user content. And so this one can be a struct. Actually, let me just compile this. We did not finish that. All right. If you get any errors when you try to do your migration, when you try to run your migration, just make sure you don't have any typos anywhere, missing parentheses or typos in the field name. That can definitely happen since all of these are just strings. So, okay, so now everything compiles. And then our next controller is going to be user content controller. All right, so if we look at our user content, we're doing user content first because comments are to a specific piece of content. So that's why we need to do user content first. And then we're going to take and create this function. Again, the only parameter is the request object. The actual field parameters are coming in from either the query string or the body of the post. So it's going to be an array. So what we're going to do here is you can see we're getting the list of user content for a specific set of owners. And from, if I remember correctly, these owners are the people that the user is following. So we're going to follow that same format. And we're going to get the list of owners from the query string. But in order to do that, we need to create a DTO. So we're going to create a new file called user DTO. And the only thing that we need in here is the UUID. Should I even bother doing that for the UUID? Let's just do it for now. For demonstration purposes, let's do it for now. So again, anything that is encoded or decoded has to be content. In this case, it's always being passed in, so it's non-optional. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take the request object, we're going to take the content, and we're going to decode it. And it's going to be of type user DTO, arrays of user DTO self, because we're taking the type and passing that in as the parameter as opposed to any specific object instance, right? And I'll show you in a moment why I needed to actually explicitly show the UUID, or set the UUID as the type here, or an array of UUIDs, that is. All right, so all I want ultimately is the IDs of all of the owners of various pieces of content. And the reason why I'm doing that is because I want to do a filter based on these owners. So in other words, only get me the list of content specific to these owners. So what is going on with this? So Fluent has, you could say, a little bit of its own language. These are just overloaded operators. And basically, they allow various ways of doing comparison. So in this case, we are indicating, or we are checking if this particular ID owner instance in this iteration, because that's what all filters are, just an iteration, exists in this container, meaning is this a subset of what's in here. There's also various other ones for doing, like, for example, contains as inside of a string. Just look it up in the documentation, and you'll see about a little more than half a dozen or so, I think. So let's make sure this compiles. It would compile if I remember to do that. What happened here? I always get confused which one is in which library. Okay. Any decode is generally going to be a throwable. So I needed to add the try. And okay, so we're good. So now we have the two, not only the models and the migration, but we also have the calls themselves. So what I think I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to, before we move on further, I'm going to test these. So let's get the list of all users. I'm going to use Postman in this case. Let's see here. All right, so I don't have anything. So we'll have our base. So the root port is 8080. And then we're going on users. It would help if I run the service. All right, so 127. Yes. So I also mention really all of these details in my introduction video. So, you know, go in there for all of this stuff. But basically, what it's complaining about is in any Vapor project application, you're always going to want to reference basically this folder, meaning the directory, the path that leads to this folder. And that's what the error that was being indicated is about. So now that error went away and we are again on port 8080. So let's see if this works. All right, sorry about that. My server was frozen for some reason, so I had to reset it. And then I also realized that this was set to name instead of database. So I fixed that, reloaded, and now the query is running. So as you can see here, we had, because we're making the call to get all users, right? So we had previously blanked out the password, and other than that, we're basically getting all of the fields for all of the users that we have. In our test case, you will recall that we only had 3 users, right? Even though we were hard coding them. So long hair, Mr. Glasses, and my lady. So I just went ahead and stuck those into my Postgres database. So this is definitely working. And then the other guy was get content owners, which happens to also be a get call, but inside of user content instead of users. So let's see what happens there. I did not put any. Oh, what am I saying? Yes. Of course. So, you may or may not be familiar with Postman. It's just a way of making calls to some web API service. You can even make GraphQL calls with it. We, however, in this case, do require the user ID list as a set of parameters in order to get their related user content, right? So, you know what? Let's make that call again, and then I'm gonna copy and paste those user IDs that we saw, and we'll stick them into, actually we can just grab the whole thing because I did make the model, the DTO, to be you know, of a model type with an ID field in it. So we can do this. So I'll go down the list and I'll grab the second guy. And then I grab the last guy. And one more time, just in case, you know, you're not that familiar. Sorry, this has to be an array. Just in case you're not that familiar, headers are in Webland the metadata for every request that is being sent and potentially being received from the server as well. And in the case of, this is a post actually. Where am I? Yes, this is a post. Just reload it one more time. So whenever you're making a post request that has a payload, that payload is going to be in JSON format. So what you want to make sure to have is in the metadata, again called headers, you want a field called content type and application/JSON, right? And then in the body itself, which again on the server side is called Vapor, you want to have the actual JSON that you're sending. Now, made another mistake here. Sorry about that. These are objects, right? So they need to be wrapped as object literals, right? So that's what the squiggly lines were complaining about. So now we have the only three users, right, that we have, and we're going to be sending it as JSON, and hopefully this will return us some data. It's a post. We have the body, JSON. What's this? There is no error. It's content type application JSON. Whoops. User content. User content. So let's debug this. So I'm going to run this and make it print out if we hit it. I was here, right? So it still says not found, and this is not being hit at all. Ah, dummy. All right, I'm sorry, guys. So I got through trying to emphasize how much we need to make sure that, you know, we have these guys set up properly, and I forgot to set them up properly. Not having a good day. All right. So now this should work, but I need to reload one last time. And okay, that was successful. We go back to Postman, we send our request. Okay, sweet. So this is our data. So this is, for the most part, like I said, with some minor differences between the client view model and the data for database schema reasons. We have our content, and I pretty much copied and pasted a lot of this stuff. So you're going to see like SM laptop, and you see like SM laptop, right? Isn't this so beautiful? Then you see, where is it? Isn't this so beautiful? So I just copied and pasted pretty much in a few insert statements in SQL on the database side. So what I'm talking about is I went to pgadmin and I did some insertions and updates or whatever the requirement was. Well, this is for comments. We're not there yet, but yeah. So I did these, and that's how this data is pre-populated. So obviously, in our case, I didn't run the migration. So you do have to run the migration yourself. I go into detail again in the other video on how to do that. So make sure you run your migration, and even though I forgot, make sure that you don't forget your entries in the config files for the controller and the create migrations. All right, so we know that our core setup, the settings, the base config, the .env file, and then the currently created models and migrations are working. So let's finish up with the, what is it? I think we have 2 left. So let's finish up with the other guys. So let's create the comments. So we want, again, Fluent. We want Vapor. Again, we're going to do a final class. So in the comments, it's somewhat larger than the other models, but what we're going to have is we're going to have the owner of the comment as well, right? So this guy will be the parent, and then again, it's going to be referencing that users table. So this is how we're going to create the name of the foreign key. So it's going to have that, and then it's also going to have another parent, but this parent is going to be optional. So this looks a little weird, but I'm gonna explain this by comparing it to the view side model. So in the case of the comment on the view model, what we did is we said that, okay, I'm making a comment, or a user is making a comment, and that user is referenced by the owner, but this comment may actually be a response to some other comment, right? So this is really the parent comment ID of this specific comment, right? And then we also have responses to the comment, meaning in the case where this comment is a parent to other comments. So the way that I am, how should I say, structuring this at the database level is I am actually going to do this, which perhaps looks a little bit weird. So what am I doing here? What I'm doing is I am actually not having any references, any structure to the children. Let's just call these children because they're also comment types, right? So I'm not having any structure in the database schema to the children, because the way that I'm looking at it is by having a reference optional, because I might be the root parent, right? So that's why this is an optional reference. But regardless, this relationship that I am creating that is in the database is really all I need to indicate the relationship, right? So by trying to create some other one-to-many or whatever it is relationship in addition is not only redundant, I'm not even entirely sure that Fluent can actually structure this properly, right? Because in the case of this current comment is the parent for these guys, right? So if I put in other words, if I put in children right here, right, is Fluent gonna know that I'm not talking about children of this guy, right, necessarily? Or is it gonna properly create that structure in the database? I'm not sure, but on top of that, even if it could, I don't even want it because it's redundant, and I think it's just going to add extra load to the database during processing. So I'll get these guys later if they exist in a secondary call, and I'll just leave it at that. So that's the rationale for this structure that I'm having here at the backend level. All right, so there's actually even more parents in this guy, and as I mentioned when I was creating the user content, every user content potentially has some comment associated to it, right? So somebody saw your posting, they liked it. Hey, you know, awesome picture, awesome video, whatever it is, right? So it makes sense to have this user content necessarily, you know, be a required parent, just like the user is, of any given comment, right? Because the comments don't stand alone. So that's that. And then, of course, the core of the comment is the actual text of the comment. So I'm leaving this guy up so you can kind of compare and contrast, right? So then, let's just finish typing this out. So then after that, we're going to have the like count. And as I mentioned last time in the video, I know that this is not, you know, how it would be in the real world. In other words, Instagram, Facebook, the company, is not building a like count field into their system that is simply, you know, a single column on the comments table, assuming they have a simplistic structure like this. Why? Why is that? It's because each like is associated to a specific user, so that the user isn't able to like a specific piece of content, comment more than one time, right? And they're also able to remove their like if they want to, right? So that association, if we're going to go that far, that association has to be there. But because it's adding a lot of complexity to what's really supposed to be a teaching version of the application, that's why I'm using this simplistic field instead of the quote-unquote, you know, more realistic one. So then we have the auditing fields. So I'm just going to copy and paste those. And then just like the other models, we're going to have our default constructor. Whoops. And then we're going to have our helper constructor. Yes. So we need our owner, and that is a requirement every time. Then we need our parent comment if one actually exists. So we make this optional. And then we may have some responses. Again, this is optional as well. What else do we have here? What else do we have here? We have then our user content. Yes, that is, yes. So I am going to do it like this. So I'm going to do it like this because forcing the caller to have the entire object is kind of cumbersome and unnecessary, since really, as you saw before in the set, we only set the ID anyway. So let's avoid doing that and make life slightly easier for ourselves. So we default to 0 on the likes. We do the same thing with the created by and last modified by, as we did with all the others. All right. So again, it's a property wrapper. So we're going to do property wrapping syntax. All right, we're almost there. Like count. I just like keeping these guys separated. Just a reminder to myself that they're the Audible related stuff. So make sure this compiles. Just drop this down a little bit. All right, so this is our model. And then where are we? So we need to make sure that we add the children since we have some parents, right? So one of them is going to be the user type. So we go into the user type, just put it near the user content. Comments. All right, so again, we are not going to reference the children. And again, the children, actually, I'm not sure I mentioned this before, but the children property wrapper is not actually required because it doesn't put anything into the database itself. It's just a reference for use on the model side of things, which again, we're not going to be lazy loading this. We'll just manually load this as required. So we have another parent in the user content. So we need to find the user content. And here's that spacer we had made earlier. So what did I call this? So that's the field on the other side, on the comment side. And then this is the field on the user content side. Let's see if I'm missing anything. I don't believe I'm missing anything. Field. And just real quick, this makes sense that it's an array because a single piece of user content can have multiple comments on it. So that's why I did that. And then this thing just compiled successfully. So we are going to go ahead and create the comment controller. Actually, we missed the creator, comment creator. So we create that first. All right, let's see here. What have we got? So we have our reference to the owner, which is the user. Of course, that's a UUID. It is required. It is non-optional. So we have our references once again. We're pointing to the users and we're pointing to the ID field in the users table. So next we have the parent comment ID, and this is its own self that it's going to be pointing back to. So obviously comments is the table, and then ID is also the field. So next we have user content. So parent user content ID. Also UUID also needs a reference. User content, and then also ID. So then we have our text field, and the text field is going to be a string. So it's going to end up being a text type in the database. And then we're going to do the light count, and then we'll do our created by, created on, all of that stuff. So the light count is generally going to be pretty small, so we can keep it an int instead of, say, a big int or something like that. And then these guys are boilerplate, so just like I did last time, I'm just going to copy and paste these guys. So we have that, and we'll keep all the field lengths and everything consistent. So we have, again, database, schema, which table am I referring to, and then delete. So what is this? Hopefully this, yep, so it completed. And then we go back to this thing that we didn't actually create. I keep getting these things in reverse. All right, so our comment controller, inheriting from route collection, the only required function is boot. We're going to do comments is equal to routes grouped, and then we're going to do comments as the sub directory. And then in this case, we're actually going to have two functions. So we're going to have get all comments, and we're going to have post, meaning add a comment. Okay. And then, I mean, just to be clear, a lot of these functions, route handlers, we're going to be updating over time. We're going to be refactoring as our application, becomes more and more fleshed out. And refactoring is definitely a common practice in software engineering. In fact, most of the time, that's really what you're doing. So doing these things even in our sort of learning application is not like some kind of bug or something. It's just good practice and good learning. So we're going to return everything. Again, we may change this later, but that's what we're going to do right now anyway. This is going to fail because of this, of course. So again, same signature, because we get the parameters being put in from the either the body or the query string, right? So then in this case, I'm just going to do a response status, because we're doing an insert in this case. So, other than throwing, because it failed, there's really nothing to send back. So I'm just going to send back a status code, because I don't like unnecessarily returning payload objects when they aren't useful. So it's just a lot of bandwidth use and back and forth. So we're going to create this DTO in a moment. If you're not familiar, DTO means data transfer object, and all it is a vehicle that is different from a model that allows you to basically, as the name implies, send or receive little bits of data. So a lot of times they're used for parameters, right? So a lot of times if you're just trying to send a parameter, you don't need, you know, all of this, right? If somebody's trying to log in, then you could say perhaps all they need is their username and their password, as opposed to having to send all of this. So this is where a data transfer object could be useful. So our DTO is gonna have, first of all, it's gonna be of type content so that it can be decoded or encoded as needed. And then we're gonna have our owner ID. And the reason why I'm just using the ID is, again, same reason. I don't want to have to send back a bunch of extraneous data that isn't really used or helpful in any way. So that's why I'm doing that. And the same reason is for the comment ID and the user content ID. But of course, user content ID is required, and so is the owner, but not the comment. So then we go back in here. Here's our guy. So let's go back to my notes. Now, how do we do this? So there's lots of ways to query. I'm not going to go over all of them, at least not in this video, but one of the ways is to access the model and then query off of the model. And another way is to access the database connection and query off of the database connection. What the heck was it? Yeah, this. And then instead of referencing the database, obviously you reference the model because you already have the database connection. So in this case, we already have the model, so we reference the database connection. So I want to get everything, right? But I want to flat map it. And why do I want to flat map it? So the reason why I want to flat map it is we are currently not in a position to, how should I say, go for a specific person, a specific user. We have some other work to flesh out currently, but we know that every comment has to have an owner on the comment, right? So what I'm doing here is I am randomly creating or randomly getting the index, and I already know that I only have 3 users, so clearly we're not going to be using this like in any production way, right? But in this test case, I know that I have 3 users, so I'm just going to randomly pick an index so that I can randomly get a user out of it. Now, when we're ready to... So why am I doing that? The reason why I'm doing that is when we are ready to flesh out the currently logged in user, right? Then we will be able to know the specific person that we need to grab, right? Then we'll be able to pass that in as a parameter to this route path, right? So we won't have to make this very large call getting everybody and then filtering down. We'll just grab the specific guy. Probably will send over the person's user ID, the currently logged in person's user ID, and then we'll receive that, do a query based on that specific ID, which will be much faster, and then we can avoid doing all of this stuff, right? But because we haven't built that piece out yet, since it's related to logging in and all of that stuff, right? We don't have it to work with. So I came up with this temporary workaround where we just randomly grab a guy, but in order to randomly grab a guy, we need to grab all of the users, right? So very roundabout, I know, but only temporary. And again, this app is supposed to be for learning purposes. So not only does it demonstrate, how to get around sort of these temporary issues that you might face in a real situation where maybe a certain API on the back end hasn't been built out yet, meaning it's simply not available yet. So then, what are you going to do, right? So quite frankly, a lot of times you end up doing this sort of thing, at least at the development periods. But having said that, so this structure, what is it about? So as you saw in all of these routes, they all return an event loop future, right? Of some associated type, right? But actually, not only do the routes return that, but all of the Fluent API calls return that as well. Some event loop future of some associated type, right? So what I'm trying to say is, in order to make this asynchronous call, we cannot use synchronous syntax. So we cannot do user dot, get me whatever, blah, 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 and do that, and then take that user and then do new comment owner ID user.id. We can't do that, okay? Because these are all asynchronous calls. All of the calls in Fluent are asynchronous calls that return event loop futures. So what we have to do instead is we have to hook in to the asynchrony by hooking into the result whenever, right? Because it's asynchronous whenever it may complete. So whenever it does complete, we're going to do a flat map. We could have done a map, we could have done a transform, but in this case, we're going to do a flat map. And the reason for that is all of these guys are being returned in an event loop future, right? So if we had done a map and made use of this, what we would end up returning is something that looks like this. Right? It would end up returning something that looks like this. So, clearly we don't want that. So what we want is to flatten, just like in an array scenario, we want to flatten down the dimensions. So we want to flatten down the result set into only a single event loop future wrapper, right? And then do whatever and then return that only. So that's why we're using a flat map. And again, more details in my other video. So, we already covered comment DTO. We grabbed the DTO. This is a parameter. Now we're going to get that parent comment ID, which again might be null. The responses, at least for now, we're going to ignore. DTO parent. Yep. And then we have the actual text, right? So now we have a new comment that's properly initialized, and we're gonna insert this into our database, right? So how do we do that? So we take this new comment that is brand new, it doesn't exist in the database, and because it is a Fluent model, we will automatically get the functions and fields available to it, and one of them of which is create. And we have to reference the database, but we call create, and that will do our insert. And again, UUID and the date timestamp of created on and last modified on are set for us automatically. So once that completes, I'm assuming here it's successful, and if it is not, it will throw anyway, and we're aware of that, right? So in this case, because I'm not dealing with a set of multiple event loop futures, right? I'm only dealing with this one guy that I'm trying to insert. I can do a map in order to convert the result set, which in this case, I believe this is void, but we're not returning void. So we can convert this result set to this guy. So let's see if this will save. No, it will not. Oh. So I am assuming that the user exists. Certainly in this case, it would, because we know that there's exactly 3 users. So that compiled. So we're gonna run our test again on Postman just to make sure. Let's start with get all comments. I believe I have this set up somewhere. Yes. Duh, not again. So again, not only do you need to remember to do this, but please remember that you need to deploy your databases. I've already done mine, meaning deploy your migrations. So I've already done mine, so I'm not going to do it again. But if you haven't done so already, please go ahead and do that. Why is this? So if this compiles, and it does, this should work. All right, sweet. So as you can see, like I said before, I just went ahead and grabbed the fake data as much as I could and just sort of randomly stuck them in there with a SQL script. Just remember that you have these associations to parents that you're going to have to create. So the parents obviously have to exist beforehand. If you're not familiar with this, because this is a script and therefore I don't have the helper from Fluent, I've enabled UUID creation inside of Postgres, and therefore I'm able to call this function, which generates a unique ID. Okay, cool. So clearly we're getting our data, and then let's see if we can post our data. So we're adding a comment, right? That's what we're doing here, right? All of this junk was just so we could get a random person out of there. until our authentication system is up and running. So in this case, I put in, because I was testing myself, obviously, before this video was made. So put in just some random thing in here. These are going to be existing data. So is this giving anything back? No. So like I said, this really doesn't return anything. It just returns a status code. That's why nothing's showing up here. But the way that we can check if we were successful is, yeah. Right? So there it is. Hello world with an exclamation. And then if you look at the timestamp, what is this, 24-hour time? Yeah, I don't know how to read 24-hour time. All right, and it might be off on the time zone anyway, but clearly this is the record we just put in. So we are almost there. We are almost there, guys. One more. Really a trivial one, but just so you have all of the code and you don't end up cursing me out, I'm just gonna finish this up. Certainly, you know, if this is too trivial and you feel like you can do it entirely yourself, go ahead and break out of the video. Just make sure you like the video and share the video. All right, so for those of you guys that are sticking around, I will sacrifice and complete the rest of the code. But this will go much faster. It's a much lighter model and migration and all that stuff. There's something about knowing that you're almost finished that just feels so amazing. All right. So our news only requires a single field, really. A single, I guess you would call it a core field, right? And then the rest of the fields are the audit fields, right? So again, I'm just going to copy and paste those. And then we have our default constructor. And then we have our helper constructor. So again, we're doing this. I don't know if you guys can hear my laptop. I have a MacBook Pro 16 and it's like getting hysterical for like no reason whatsoever. The only thing I have up is the Xcode sessions and the OBS, and it's deciding to get a freak on. Yep. Hopefully 16-inch M1 will be much better. All right, so does this compile? All right, cool. So it compiles and we create our news migration. Our news migration. Oh no, this thing is getting louder and louder. So our table is called news. We have also an ID just like everything else. The one core field, again, this is going to be custom. Again, if you get strange errors when you're trying to migrate, it's probably a typo. So the errors really are not that great, the messages. So if you're doing a migration and you see an error, just go in here and double check all of the strings that you typed them correctly, especially when you're doing like custom calls and stuff, that you close them properly and all of that stuff. More than likely the issue is there. So we do our revert. Okay, quick build. Okay, nice. We are moving. All right. So now, one thing, guys, a lot of you have been asking for the source code, whether it be the the boilerplate, because nobody wants to type all of this junk out, right? But I have not been making that available, obviously. And the reason for that is people just take the source code sometimes and they don't watch the actual video, which hurts me immensely. But what I am going to do for you, because I'm getting so many requests for the source code, is if we manage to make it all the way to the last video, which, to be quite frank with you, for some of the last few videos that I've been making, I haven't really gotten the view counts that I wanted. But assuming that we do, I will make all of the source code in its entirety, including even this, and then the scripts that I use to populate the database. And of course, we're going to have more scripts over time as we continue to flesh everything out. But I'll make all of that code available in my GitHub, and you guys can have at it. But that's only going to happen if we actually make it to the last video. In addition to that, an idea that I've been sort of thinking about is having a different video series where I'm just going to compile this, where I go through the entire step, building an app, submitting it to the App Store, potentially getting rejected, dealing with whatever needs to be fixed, whatever reasons they give for the rejection, submitting it again, hopefully getting accepted, and then getting on the App Store. So I'm thinking about doing a series on that entire A to Z process for my next set of videos. So if you like that idea, definitely let me know in the comments. So we're going to run this, and of course we're going to test it. I don't believe I have this pre-made. And of course, why would I remember? I've only done this 3 times, and not including all the testing that I was doing by myself. So how could I possibly remember to do this? All right. Bam, boom, bada bing, bada boom. Here we go. So what we had on the client is now although it's still fake data for the time being, is now for real on the database. Oops. As you saw before, right? And being gotten and being set by a real server, right? And again, we are using Vapor in order to take advantage of all the niceties that come with using the same language both on the back end and the front end. And prime example of that is our date utils helper, which we put into a Swift package so we could just reuse it on both the client side and the back end, right? And we're going to be doing, even more of this as the app progresses and we create more helpers and all of that stuff. But being able to leverage our existing Swift skills on both ends of the application, right? Being able to maintain a single querying style syntax no matter what actual backend database we use, Postgres, MongoDB, MySQL, SQLite. Huge benefits, huge time savers, huge productivity enhancements. So that's what we're trying to do. That's what we started with this first video for getting Vapor into our InstaClone application. And once again, I thank you for watching. Share the video, like the video, subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks. See you next time.